What if the last hours of a legendary life weren't quiet, dignified, or peaceful, but loud, fractured, and filled with warnings no one wanted to hear? That question sat unanswered for days as headlines exploded, timelines blurred, and social media did what it always does in moments like this. It filled the silence with speculation. But behind the noise, behind the trending hashtags and half-formed theories, there was a deeper, more unsettling question that refused to go away. What really happened in those final hours? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Not the sanitized version. Not the early headlines rushed out before dawn. Not the versions shaped by grief, fear, or loyalty. The version that exists in fragments. In glances. In words said too late. In moments people replay endlessly in their minds and whisper to themselves, "If only I had known." Because when a story like this breaks, it doesn't just shock. It unsettles. It makes people look at their own families differently. It makes them ask uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people closest to us. And this story matters now because it wasn't supposed to end this way. From the outside, everything looked intact, successful, even celebratory. A respected figure nearing the end of a long career. A holiday season. A house filled with history and memories. A family name woven into decades of cultural moments. Nothing about that picture suggested collapse. But collapse doesn't announce itself. It leaks. Slowly. Quietly. Through small fractures no one wants to acknowledge. A missed call. A tense dinner. A conversation cut short. A look that lingers just a second too long. Those are the details people ignore, until they're all that's left. In the hours before everything unraveled, there were signs. Not sirens. Not screams. Signs. The kind that feel harmless at the time. The kind people later describe with a shake of the head and a sentence that always starts the same way. At the time, it didn't seem important. And that's the most dangerous phrase in any true crime story. Because importance is only obvious in hindsight. That night began like so many others in that world. Laughter. Familiar faces. A sense of routine dressed up as celebration. There were no flashing warnings, no dramatic confrontations that screamed tragedy was coming. Just subtle tension beneath polite smiles. Words chosen carefully. Glances exchanged when someone thought no one was watching. Some would later say they felt something was off, but couldn't explain why. Others insisted everything seemed fine. And that contradiction alone tells us something critical. Truth doesn't arrive cleanly. It arrives fractured. In the days after, one narrative tried to take control. Then another still. Each version competing for dominance. Each claiming clarity. Each insisting they had the missing piece. But clarity is rarely immediate in stories like this. What spreads first is confusion. Confusion about timelines. Confusion about motives. Confusion about relationships people thought they understood. And into that confusion rush assumptions. Because silence makes people uncomfortable. And unanswered questions create space for imagination to run wild. But imagination is not evidence. And yet, imagination often circles something real. As investigators worked quietly, as statements were released carefully, something else was happening in parallel. Online forums dissected every photograph. Comment sections replayed past interviews. Old footage resurfaced, stripped of context and reinterpreted through a darker lens. Moments once seen as harmless suddenly looked ominous. Was that joke actually a warning? Was that laugh forced? Was that silence intentional? You see how this works. Once a tragedy occurs, the past gets rewritten. But somewhere beneath the noise, beneath the rewriting and the rushing to conclusions, there is a quieter story. One that doesn't scream. One that doesn't trend instantly. One that requires patience to hear. That story isn't about a single night. It's about years. Years of expectations. Years of pressure. Years of unspoken resentments that didn't disappear just because success arrived. Because success doesn't heal everything. Sometimes it hides the damage long enough for it to deepen. Families under pressure don't always fracture loudly. Sometimes they tighten. They close ranks. They convince themselves that proximity equals closeness. But proximity without honesty is just distance in disguise. And that's where this story truly begins. Not with flashing lights or breaking news alerts, but with a family dynamic that had been quietly evolving for years. A dynamic shaped by ambition, disappointment, loyalty, and fear, a dynamic that outsiders couldn't see, but insiders felt every day. The public image was one thing. The private reality was another. And in between those two versions existed a tension that no amount of success could resolve. People want simple villains in stories like this. Simple answers. A clean arc where everything makes sense in the final act. But real life doesn't work that way. Real life is messy. Motivations overlap. Love coexists with anger. Fear disguises itself as entitlement. Control masquerades as protection. And when everything finally breaks, everyone involved believes their version of events is the true one. That's why this case ignited so quickly, because it taps into something universal. The fear that we don't truly know what's happening behind closed doors. The fear that warning signs are only obvious once it's too late. The fear that a family can sit together in one room and still be worlds apart. In the hours leading up to the tragedy, there were moments that now feel weighted with meaning. A conversation that ended abruptly. A departure that felt colder than usual. A silence that lingered long after the music stopped. At the time, they were dismissed as normal. Stress, fatigue, personality clashes. But after, everything changed. Those moments became evidence. Those silences became deafening. Those choices became irreversible. And one question rose above all others. Was this inevitable? Or was there a point where things could have turned another way? That question is what keeps this story alive. Not just the outcome, but the possibility that it didn't have to end there. Because somewhere in those final hours, there was a crossroads. A moment when things could have shifted. A conversation that could have gone differently. A decision that could have altered everything. We just don't know exactly where that moment was. Yet, what we do know is this. The official timeline only tells part of the story. And the public narrative misses crucial context. Context about relationships. About patterns. About tensions that didn't start that night and didn't end with it. As we move forward, we're not chasing shock for shock's sake. We're tracing a slow unraveling. One that began long before anyone realized it was happening. We'll look at the warning signs people dismissed. The contradictions that don't line up cleanly. The moments that were overlooked because they didn't fit the story people wanted to believe. And we'll ask the uncomfortable questions others avoided. What happens when expectations turn into pressure? When dependence masquerades as closeness? When love and resentment coexist without resolution? Most importantly, we'll examine how a family story became a public reckoning, and why the truth may be far more complex than any headline suggests. Because what happened that night didn't start that night. And what came next would force everyone involved to confront something far more unsettling than a single act. The realization that the signs were always there. They were just easier to ignore. But what no one could ignore was what happened after those final hours came to light, when one revelation triggered another, and the story took a turn no one saw coming. Did anyone in that room realize they were watching the final calm before everything collapsed? That question hangs over the night like a low, humming wire. Because on the surface, nothing about it screamed disaster. No raised voices. No broken glass. No dramatic exits that made people turn their heads. Just a gathering. Familiar faces. Seasonal warmth. The kind of night people replay later and say, it was just another party. But that's how most endings begin. Disguised as normal. The holiday season has a way of lowering defenses. People drink a little more. Laugh a little louder. Pretend, just for an evening, that whatever has been simmering underneath can wait until January. And for a few hours that night, that's exactly what it felt like. A room full of history, of shared memories, of long-running relationships built on decades of proximity and mutual admiration. The kind of environment where everyone knows everyone else's rhythm, who tells the same story every year, who drifts toward the same corner of the room, who avoids which conversations. Comfortable, predictable, and yet something was off. No one could quite name it at the time. That's the strange part. People sensed a shift, but lacked the language to describe it. Later, when they tried to put words to it, they struggled. Because how do you explain a feeling you ignored? There were smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Laughter that came half a second too late. A tension that didn't explode, but hovered. You felt it before. That moment when a room feels slightly colder even though the temperature hasn't changed. This wasn't a stranger's gathering. It was a space filled with people who had known each other for years. Some for decades. That's why the subtle changes mattered. Because when patterns shift among familiar faces, It means something has changed beneath the surface. Rob and Michelle arrived together. That detail would later be replayed endlessly. Who walked in first? Who spoke to whom? Who lingered? Who didn't? From the outside, they looked composed, polite, present. But present doesn't always mean connected. People often mistake physical proximity for emotional alignment. Standing side by side doesn't mean standing together. They greeted friends, exchanged pleasantries, made the rounds. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But those who knew them well noticed something quieter, a restraint, a carefulness in their interactions that hadn't always been there before. Conversations kept light. Topics steered away from anything remotely personal, as if certain subjects had been silently banned. And then there was Nick. He was there too, present, but not quite integrated. In the room, but orbiting its edges. Not fully withdrawn, not fully engaged. That liminal state, half in, half out, is often where tension lives. Some would later say he seemed distracted. Others said restless. A few insisted he looked perfectly normal, just tired. And that disagreement alone tells you how slippery perception can be. Because people see what they expect to see. If you believe everything is fine, every odd moment becomes meaningless. If you suspect something is wrong, every glance becomes evidence. That night, most people chose the first option. Why wouldn't they? This was a familiar scene, a familiar family, a familiar setting. There was no reason to assume this night would be different from any other holiday gathering they'd attended together. Except it was. Conversations drifted. Drinks were poured. Laughter rose and fell. Time passed. At some point, the family separated into different conversational clusters. That happens naturally at gatherings like this. It's not unusual. It's not suspicious. Until you look back. Rob spent time speaking with longtime friends. People he trusted. People he had known through decades of professional and personal evolution. He appeared engaged, animated at moments. But those closest to him would later say something was missing. Ease. The ease he once carried effortlessly seemed muted, as if every sentence was weighed before being spoken. Michelle moved through the room differently. Observant, attentive, checking in, not hovering, but not entirely relaxed either. There's a difference between social grace and emotional vigilance. She had mastered the first long ago. The second had become necessary more recently. And Nick? He floated, sometimes present in conversation, sometimes pulling away. At one point, he was seen standing alone longer than expected. At another, he inserted himself abruptly into a discussion, only to leave again moments later. Was it anxiety? Irritation? Fatigue? At the time, no one knew, and no one pressed. That's another recurring theme in stories like this. The moments when people choose politeness over curiosity, comfort over confrontation, because asking questions can feel invasive, especially when everything appears fine on the surface. But appearances are curated things. As the night progressed, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't silence the room. It didn't cause a scene. It was a conversation. Quiet, contained, but charged. A lifelong family friend would later describe it as tense. Not loud, not explosive, just sharp enough to register. Words exchanged in low tones. Faces set. Body language closed. It happened away from the center of the room. Off to the side. The kind of exchange most people don't notice unless they're looking directly at it. But those who did notice felt it immediately. Because tension has weight. And that exchange wasn't just between strangers. It was between people whose history ran deep. Whose roles had been established long ago. Whose expectations of one another were rigid and long-standing. No one heard every word. That's important. What survives are impressions, fragments, emotional residues, raised eyebrows, tightened jaws, a pause that lasted just a little too long. Some later said it felt like an argument that had been happening for years, finally breaking through the surface. Others insisted it was just a disagreement, nothing more. Again, contradictions. But here's what everyone agrees on. The mood changed. After that moment, the night didn't quite recover its rhythm. Conversations resumed, but something essential had been disrupted. The laughter sounded thinner. The ease didn't return. And that's when people began to drift. Not all at once. Not abruptly. Just gradually. One goodbye, then another. The natural winding down of a party. Except it didn't feel entirely natural. People left with a sense of unfinished business. of something unresolved lingering in the air. Rob and Michelle stayed composed. No outward signs of distress. No visible cracks. But those who said goodbye noticed something subtle. Their smiles didn't linger. Nick left separately. That detail would become significant later. At the time, it was dismissed as nothing. Different plans. Different timing. No reason to read into it. Except timing matters when stories are reconstructed. Who left when? Who spoke last? Who said what, or didn't? Those details become anchors in the chaos that follows. As cars pulled away and the house emptied, the night receded into memory. People returned to their own lives, their own homes, their own routines. They didn't know they were leaving behind a moment that would be examined under a microscope. Because hindsight is merciless. Every choice made that night would later be scrutinized. Why didn't someone intervene? Why didn't someone ask a question? Why didn't someone notice something was wrong? But that's the trap. You can't respond to danger you don't recognize as danger. And that night, danger didn't look like danger. It looked like family tension, like stress, like something that would be talked through later, something that could wait until morning. Except morning didn't bring resolution. It brought something else entirely. As Rob and Michelle returned home, the weight of the evening followed them. Unspoken, unresolved. A conversation paused but not ended. And somewhere between that front door closing and the early hours that followed, whatever had been contained finally escaped. But before we get there, we need to understand what that tension was really about. Because that quiet exchange at the party wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't isolated. It didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the surface ripple of a deeper conflict that had been building for years. A conflict shaped by expectations, dependency, disappointment, and control. And to understand how everything unraveled, we have to go backward into the patterns that made that night inevitable. Because what happened after the party wasn't the beginning. It was the breaking point. And once we examine what had been quietly escalating behind closed doors, the events that followed start to look far less random and far more chilling. What if the real warning signs weren't hidden at all, but hiding in plain sight? That question becomes impossible to ignore once you step back from the chaos of that final night and look at the years leading up to it. Because when investigators later began tracing the emotional timeline, not just the physical one, they kept circling the same uncomfortable realization. Nothing here started suddenly. The tension that surfaced at the party didn't materialize out of thin air. It was familiar, rehearsed, revisited. A conversation that had been paused and restarted so many times it no longer needed raised voices to carry weight. Families don't fracture in a single moment. They erode. Slowly, quietly, in ways that feel manageable until they're not. From the outside, the family looked solid, established, protected by success and routine. That image wasn't fake, it just wasn't complete. And incomplete pictures are often the most misleading. Inside the home, roles had been set long ago. Roles that made sense once upon a time, but grew strained as circumstances changed. When people don't update expectations, resentment fills the gap. Rob had spent decades as the center of gravity, not just professionally, but personally. Decision-maker, provider, the one whose judgment carried weight. In many families, that dynamic evolves naturally as time passes. In others, it calcifies. And when it does, it creates pressure points. Michelle, by contrast, had learned to read emotional weather early. She noticed shifts before others did. She felt tension before it became visible. That awareness was both a strength and a burden. Because noticing doesn't always mean knowing how to fix. She often found herself in the role of stabilizer, the one smoothing edges, translating tones, managing moods, a role many partners slip into without realizing how much it costs them. And then there was Nick. His place in the family was complicated long before anyone outside noticed. Not because he didn't belong, but because expectations around him were never entirely clear. Expectation is a strange thing. Too little of it can feel like neglect. Too much can feel like suffocation. And when expectations are inconsistent, they create confusion that hardens into frustration. For years, there had been a quiet debate within the family about direction, about independence, about responsibility. Not dramatic arguments, just persistent, unresolved questions. What does adulthood look like here? What does support mean? When does help become control? Those questions don't have universal answers, but families often act as if they do. There were moments when things seemed to improve. Periods of calm. Times when everyone convinced themselves that whatever strain existed had eased. Those stretches are deceptive, because improvement without resolution is just delay. Friends noticed. Those questions haunted the relationship. Rob, for his part, struggled with a different conflict. Letting go. When you spend decades being the one people rely on, stepping back doesn't feel natural. It can feel like abandonment, or failure, or loss of purpose. So guidance can slip into control, advice into insistence, concern into monitoring. And once that line is crossed, it's hard to step back without acknowledging it happened. Michelle often found herself caught between these perspectives. Wanting peace, wanting understanding, wanting everyone to feel heard. But mediation has limits, especially when no one is willing to redefine their role. As months turned into years, the household adapted around the tension rather than addressing it. Schedules shifted. Communication became more transactional. Emotional honesty gave way to logistics. Who's doing what? When? Where? Safe topics. And yet, the underlying conflict remained. Friends recall moments when optimism resurfaced. Plans discussed. Fresh starts imagined. Those moments mattered because they show no one believed disaster was inevitable. Everyone thought there was time. Time to figure things out. Time to talk later. Time to cool off. Time is a dangerous assumption, because while people wait, pressure builds. Nick's frustration deepened in ways few fully understood. Feeling simultaneously supported and constrained creates a kind of emotional whiplash. You're not abandoned, but you're not free either. That state breeds restlessness, and restlessness seeks expression, sometimes through confrontation, sometimes through withdrawal, sometimes through behavior that looks irrational from the outside. Rob responded to that restlessness with increasing concern that came out as firmness, as boundaries, as expectations. And boundaries only work when both sides agree on where they are. Here, they didn't. That disconnect showed up in subtle ways. Tone, timing, body language. The way conversations ended abruptly. The way apologies were offered without resolution. No one wanted to escalate things. Everyone wanted calm. But calm without clarity is fragile. By the time the holiday season arrived, the family was carrying years of emotional residue. The party wasn't the cause. It was the spark that landed on something already dry. The conversation that turned tense that night? It wasn't new. It was familiar. It had happened in different forms before. What made it different this time was exhaustion. Everyone involved was tired. Tired of the same arguments. Tired of the same reassurances. Tired of the same unresolved questions. Exhaustion lowers restraint. It shortens tempers. It sharpens words. It removes the buffer that once kept things contained. And once restraint slips, things said can't be unsaid. That's why the argument lingered emotionally long after it ended physically. Why it followed everyone home. Because it wasn't about that moment alone. It was about everything it represented. Unmet expectations. Unacknowledged resentment. A future no one could agree on. And when people carry that kind of emotional weight, they don't leave it at the door. They bring it home. As the house settled into silence that night, the tension didn't dissipate. It condensed, concentrated, pressed inward. This is the phase people misunderstand most. They imagine danger looks loud, chaotic, obvious. But often, it looks quiet. Too quiet. A silence thick enough to feel. A stillness that doesn't soothe but unsettles. And within that silence, unresolved emotions don't rest. They replay. They magnify. They distort. The party may have ended hours earlier, but the conflict hadn't gone anywhere. It was still present, still active, still unresolved. And as the night wore on, that unresolved tension would collide with fatigue, emotion, and proximity in ways no one had prepared for. Because the patterns that built over years don't disappear just because the lights go out. They wait. And what happened next didn't come from nowhere. It came from everything that had been left unsaid. What happens when the noise finally stops, and no one knows what to say next? That question matters more than any raised voice or tense exchange, because silence is where everything changed. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that hums. The kind that presses against your ears and makes every thought sound louder than it should. After the party, after the drive home, after the front door closed and the world outside disappeared, the house didn't settle the way it usually did. Houses have rhythms. You feel them if you live somewhere long enough. The familiar sounds. The routines that tell you everything is normal even when you don't consciously think about it. That night, the rhythm felt off. Lights came on and off. Footsteps moved through rooms without conversation trailing behind them. Doors closed a little more firmly than necessary. Not slammed, just final. Fatigue played its role. Emotional exhaustion always does. When people are tired, restraint weakens. Words feel heavier. Silence feels louder. Rob carried the weight of the unresolved conversation with him. You could sense it in the way he moved, slower, more deliberate. As if he were replaying the evening in his head, testing different versions of the same exchange. What should I have said differently? Should I have pushed harder or less? Did I make it worse? Those questions don't arrive gently. They arrive all at once. Michelle noticed immediately that the night hadn't released its grip. She had learned to read these shifts long ago. The way emotional tension follows people home even when they pretend to leave it behind. She tried, quietly, to restore normalcy. Routine is a powerful coping mechanism. Simple actions, familiar gestures, the illusion of order. But routine can erase unresolved emotion. And Nick, he didn't decompress. He tightened. That distinction matters. Some people unwind after tension. Others coil. The energy doesn't dissipate. It redirects inward, becoming sharper, more focused. He moved through the house with purpose, but without ease. The feeling that everything had been said, but nothing resolved, clung to him. This is the moment most people overlook when they reconstruct stories later. They jump from argument to outcome. But in between is something far more dangerous. Rumination. The replaying of words. The reinterpreting of tone. The assigning of meaning to silence. Rumination doesn't need new input. It feeds on memory. And when people ruminate in close proximity, without space or interruption, emotions can escalate without a single word being spoken. The house became a container for that escalation. Rooms that once felt comforting now felt tight. Familiar spaces suddenly offered no relief. The walls didn't absorb the tension, they reflected it. Time passed strangely. Minutes stretched. Moments blurred. No one slept right away. That detail matters too. Sleep is a reset. Without it, emotional regulation frays. Rob tried to disengage mentally. He had done this before. Told himself that the conversation could be revisited later. That nothing needed to be resolved immediately. That tempers would cool. But something felt different this time. The unease didn't fade. It deepened. Michelle sensed it too. That intuitive awareness that something unresolved wasn't just lingering. It was intensifying. She felt pulled between wanting to give space and wanting to intervene. Intervention is a gamble. Too early, and it escalates. Too late, and it's ineffective. She hesitated. Nick's internal state shifted in ways no one could see. The frustration he'd carried for years felt suddenly unbearable. Not because it was new, but because it had reached a saturation point. When emotions accumulate without release, they don't just sit there. They seek expression. Sometimes that expression is conversation. Sometimes it's withdrawal. And sometimes it's confrontation driven less by logic than by pressure. Pressure that has nowhere else to go. The house remained quiet, but it wasn't calm. Silence, in this context, wasn't peace. It was compression. Each person occupied their own mental space, but those spaces were not separate. They overlapped. They collided. Rob reflected on responsibility, on what he owed, on what he expected, on how much guidance was too much, on whether stepping back would help or harm. Those are heavy questions for someone who has spent a lifetime being the steady center. Michelle thought about balance, about protecting everyone involved, about the emotional labor she had quietly carried for years, about whether she could keep doing it. And Nick thought about agency, about being seen, about whether he was being trusted or managed, about whether the path laid out for him was ever really his. 3 people, 1 house, 3 internal narratives running simultaneously. That combination is volatile. At some point, the quiet broke. Not with shouting, not with chaos, but with movement. A conversation resumed. Not planned, not prepared, just unavoidable. It began cautiously. Words chosen carefully, voices controlled. But control under pressure is fragile. The conversation circled familiar ground. Expectations, boundaries, responsibility. The same terrain they'd navigated before, but now with less patience. Fatigue stripped away cushioning. Every word landed harder than intended. Every pause felt loaded. Rob spoke from concern, from fear, from a place shaped by years of responsibility. Nick heard judgment, limitation, dismissal. Michelle tried to mediate again, tried to slow things down, tried to reframe. But mediation only works when all parties are willing to pause. That night, pausing felt impossible. The emotional distance between intention and perception widened with every sentence. This is where stories often fracture irreversibly, not because someone intends harm, but because misunderstanding compounds faster than clarity. A word meant as guidance becomes control. A question meant as care becomes accusation. A pause meant as restraint becomes rejection. And once those interpretations lock in, it's hard to undo them. The tension sharpened. No one wanted it to escalate. Everyone wanted resolution. But resolution requires agreement, and agreement felt unreachable. The conversation reached an impasse. And impasses are dangerous because they trap emotion. No one left the house. No one disengaged completely. The proximity remained. Physical closeness without emotional alignment is combustible. At some point, voices lowered again. Not because things were resolved, but because energy had peaked. Silence returned. But this silence was different. Heavier. More charged. It carried everything that had just been said, and everything that hadn't. People later asked why someone didn't leave. Why space wasn't created. Why the situation wasn't diffused. But those questions assumed clarity. Inside that house, clarity was gone. There was only emotion. Emotion doesn't follow logic. It follows momentum. And the momentum that night was inward. Each person retreated into their own thoughts, but those thoughts were no longer calm. Rob felt the weight of concern harden into fear. Michelle felt the burden of mediation turn into dread. Nick felt frustration crystallize into something sharper. No one recognized this shift as dangerous in the moment. They recognized it as pain. And pain is something families believe they can endure. What they didn't realize was that endurance had reached its limit. Because the longer silence stretched, the more unstable it became. Moments passed without movement, without sound. But internally, everything was still in motion. This is the part of the story no one likes to talk about. Because it's uncomfortable. Because it doesn't fit neatly into cause and effect. Because it asks us to confront how quickly normal can become fragile. How easily familiar spaces can feel threatening. How unresolved emotions can turn inward and distort perception. And how silence, when filled with pressure, can be the most dangerous sound of all. What happened next didn't erupt instantly. It unfolded, slowly enough that it could have been interrupted, quickly enough that it wasn't. And once it began, there was no clean way to stop it, because the quiet had already done its work. Have you ever felt a situation shift before anything actually happens? Like the air itself has decided something is about to go wrong? That's the only way to describe what came next. Not a sudden explosion, not a scream, just a subtle, almost imperceptible change in momentum. The kind that makes your body tense before your mind catches up. Inside the house, the silence didn't break. It bent. Each person was still where they'd been moments earlier, but something fundamental had changed. The emotional ground beneath them no longer felt stable. It felt angled, slanted towards something none of them could fully see yet. This is the phase people rarely understand when they try to reconstruct a tragedy. They imagine a clear before and after. Calm, then chaos. But real collapse is quieter. It's a series of micro shifts. Small changes in posture, in breathing, in perception. Rob felt it first, not as fear, but as unease. The kind that makes you reassess your surroundings without knowing why. He became acutely aware of the house itself. The distance between rooms. The weight of the hour. The fact that it was late enough for exhaustion to blur judgment. Time matters here. Late hours distort everything. They magnify emotion. They shrink patience. They make solutions feel farther away than they are. Michelle sensed the shift too. She'd learned to trust that instinct. The feeling that the emotional temperature had crossed a threshold and wasn't coming back down on its own. Her instinct was to ground the moment. To reintroduce structure. Something practical. Something normal. A question. A suggestion. A task. Normalcy can interrupt spirals if it arrives early enough. She tried. The attempt didn't land the way she hoped. Nick was no longer in a space where grounding felt comforting. It felt intrusive. like another attempt to redirect rather than understand. That distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. To someone seeking regulation, grounding is relief. To someone seeking agency, it feels like control. His response is shortened. His body language closed. Not aggressive, contained. But containment has its own intensity. This is where internal narratives fully diverged. Rob interpreted the withdrawal as resistance. Nick interpreted concern as pressure. Michelle interpreted both as danger. And none of them were entirely wrong. The house felt smaller now. Familiar hallways felt narrower. The sense of being trapped didn't come from locked doors. It came from unresolved emotion pressing inward. Movement resumed. Not frantic. Purposeful. Someone stood. Someone shifted rooms. Space was attempted, but not cleanly created. Clean space requires clarity. This was messy space. Rob moved with the intention of resetting the interaction. Distance, even brief, can recalibrate emotion. He had used that strategy before. Step away. Let the moment cool. But cooling requires time. And time felt scarce. Nick followed. Not to confront, but not to disengage either. That middle ground is dangerous. It keeps energy alive without directing it productively. Michelle stayed between them, physically and emotionally. That position is exhausting. Balancing, translating, absorbing. It's also unsustainable. Words resumed, but they were different now. Less explanatory, more declarative. Statements instead of questions. Statements are harder to soften. The conversation circled familiar themes again, but now each repetition carried more weight. Like a needle hitting the same groove in a record, deepening it every time. Rob spoke about responsibility, about concern, about the future. Nick heard finality, limits, judgments already made. Michelle tried to slow the pace again, tried to suggest revisiting things later. Tomorrow, after rest. Tomorrow felt unreal. That's another hallmark of these moments. The future collapses into the present. Everything feels urgent even when it isn't. Nick's frustration tipped into something more rigid. Not rage, resolve. A hardening of perspective where alternatives no longer feel available. This is the most misunderstood emotional state. People assume danger comes from chaos. But rigidity is often more dangerous. Because rigidity doesn't seek release. It seeks conclusion. Rob sensed that shift too, though he couldn't articulate it. He felt the conversation slipping beyond his ability to guide it back to calm. That realization unsettled him. Authority works until it doesn't. And when it stops working, those used to relying on it can feel suddenly exposed. Michelle felt the strain in her body now. The fatigue. The emotional overload. The sense that she was holding too many threads and none of them were strong enough. She tried once more to intervene, not with logic, but with emotion. Appealing to shared history. To care. To connection. Emotional appeals can bridge gaps. But only if both sides are still looking for bridges. Nick wasn't. Not in that moment. He wasn't looking backward. He was looking inward. At everything he felt had been decided for him long before this night. That internal reckoning reached a turning point. The conversation stopped again. Not because it resolved, but because it exhausted itself. Silence returned. But this silence wasn't compressed. It was brittle. Everyone felt it. That sense that the emotional structure had cracked and was now unstable. That one wrong movement could shatter it completely. No one knew what the wrong movement was. That uncertainty is terrifying. Michelle suggested space again. Real space this time. Separate rooms. Time to breathe. Rob hesitated, but agreed. Agreement came too late to feel reassuring. Nick didn't respond verbally. He moved away. That movement, simple, unremarkable, would later be replayed endlessly in people's minds. Because it marked a point of no return. Separation doesn't always de-escalate. Sometimes it gives emotions room to expand unchecked. Each person retreated into isolation, but isolation didn't bring calm. It intensified internal narratives. Rob questioned everything. His approach, his tone, his assumptions. The fear that he had miscalculated weighed heavily. Michelle felt dread settle in. A sense that whatever balance she had been maintaining was gone. That she was no longer buffering tension. Just witnessing it. Nick's thoughts narrowed. The world reduced to a single, unyielding conclusion about control, autonomy, and being unheard. When perception narrows, options disappear. Minutes passed, or hours. Time blurred. No one slept. Sleep would have changed everything. It resets emotional chemistry. It restores perspective. But sleep didn't come. Instead, each person remained locked in their own version of the story. And those stories no longer overlapped. This is the moment people wish they could rewind to. The last point where interruption was possible. Where someone could have left. Where distance could have turned into safety instead of escalation. But rewinding assumes awareness. Inside that house, awareness had collapsed under exhaustion and emotion. The house itself bore witness. Still, unmoving, holding the weight of everything unfolding inside it. And then something shifted again. A sound, a movement, a choice. Small, seemingly insignificant. But once made, it couldn't be taken back. Because that choice, made in isolation, under pressure, would set the final sequence in motion. And once it did, the story crossed a line. Nick's isolation wasn't empty. It was crowded with thoughts. Old memories replayed with new emphasis. Conversations from years earlier resurfaced, stripped of nuance and replayed as proof. When people reach this state, they stop asking questions. They start reaching conclusions. He wasn't thinking about the party anymore. Not really. The party had simply triggered something much older. A sense of being permanently positioned, permanently evaluated, permanently steered. That feeling doesn't shout. It settles. And once it settles, it reframes everything. Meanwhile, Rob's isolation carried a different weight. His thoughts moved backward and forward at the same time. Backward through decades of decisions. Forward through imagined outcomes. He wondered whether his concern had crossed into insistence. Whether his attempts to help had hardened into pressure without him noticing. That realization is disorienting for someone who has long believed their role was clear and necessary. Authority feels secure until it doesn't. Michelle's isolation was the heaviest. Not because she carried more blame, but because she carried more awareness. She sensed that the emotional center of the house had collapsed. That the usual equilibrium she maintained was gone. She felt caught between wanting to intervene again and fearing that intervention might make things worse. That's the cruel paradox of mediation. Do nothing and regret it. Do something and fear causing harm. She chose stillness. Stillness, however, can be misread. Silence can feel like abandonment. Distance can feel like dismissal. Pausing can feel like choosing sides, even when it isn't. Each person interpreted the quiet differently. Nick interpreted it as confirmation. Rob interpreted it as failure. Michelle interpreted it as danger. And here's the most important thing to understand about this moment. No one believed they were standing on the edge of something irreversible. They believed they were enduring something painful. There's a difference. Pain feels survivable. Irreversibility doesn't. The house itself didn't offer relief. Familiar objects felt heavy with meaning. Every room held echoes of conversations that had never fully resolved. The environment reinforced the sense of being trapped inside a story that wouldn't change. That's when internal decisions start to harden. Not decisions like, I'm going to do something drastic. Decisions like, this isn't going to change. They don't understand me. Nothing I do will be enough. I don't have another option. Those thoughts don't arrive as declarations. They arrive as conclusions, quiet, seemingly rational conclusions formed under emotional strain. And once a conclusion feels final, behavior follows. Nick's movements became more deliberate, not frantic, focused. That focus is often mistaken for calm. But it's not calm. It's narrowing. Narrowing attention. Narrowing options. Narrowing perception. When perception narrows, the world simplifies dangerously. Rob, in his own space, tried to distract himself with logic. With planning. With the idea that tomorrow would bring perspective. Tomorrow is a powerful illusion. It allows people to postpone urgency, to assume continuity. He didn't realize that tomorrow was already slipping out of reach. Michelle paced quietly, listening, not eavesdropping, but attuned. The kind of listening that picks up absence rather than sound. The house didn't feel settled. She felt it in her body. A tension that wouldn't release. A sense that something essential was misaligned. She considered intervening again. She didn't. That hesitation would later haunt her in ways no one deserves. But hesitation isn't wrongdoing. It's human. Especially when the stakes aren't yet clear. Time passed in fragments. Moments stretched without markers. No clocks checked. No reference points. Just the slow accumulation of emotion. Nick's internal narrative solidified. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was quiet and firm. This is how it's going to be. This is what they think of me. This is what my life looks like. That certainty didn't bring relief. It brought resolve. Resolve can feel empowering when someone has felt powerless. That's why it's dangerous. Rob's thoughts drifted toward responsibility again, toward what he should say next, how he should reframe things in the morning. He rehearsed sentences in his head, softer ones, more open ones. He didn't realize those sentences would never be spoken. Michelle felt the house holding its breath. She didn't know why. She just knew. This is another uncomfortable truth about stories like this. Intuition often arrives without explanation. People feel something is wrong but can't justify acting on it. And without justification, they freeze. Because acting on a feeling feels irrational, until hindsight reframes it as foresight. Nick moved again. Not hurried. Not chaotic. Purposeful. This is the moment where isolation turns into action, not because of impulse, but because of conclusion. People often imagine danger comes from loss of control. In reality, it often comes from the illusion of control. The belief that everything has been considered, that the outcome is inevitable, that alternatives don't exist. That belief is powerful, and it's almost always wrong. Rob heard movement, but didn't register it as a warning. Houses make noise. People move. Nothing about it felt alarming yet. Michelle noticed too, but interpreted it differently. She felt the shift again. That internal alarm that doesn't have a clear signal. She stood. This detail matters. She didn't rush. She didn't shout. She stood, as if preparing to re-enter the emotional space she'd stepped out of. That choice, to stand rather than stay seated, was an instinctive one. Instinctive choices don't come from analysis. They come from experience. She had felt this before. Not exactly like this, but close enough to recognize the pattern. The pattern of escalation disguised as quiet. She moved toward the shared space. Nick was already there. Their paths intersected at a moment loaded with misunderstanding. Not confrontation, yet. Just presence. Presence can feel threatening when someone feels cornered internally. Words were exchanged. Brief. Controlled. Rob emerged too, sensing that something was happening he needed to address. Three people converged again. The separation that was meant to cool things had instead intensified them. This convergence didn't come with shouting. It came with tension so thick it felt tangible. The conversation resumed, but it wasn't the same conversation as before. Before, there had been room for negotiation. Now, there was finality. Nick spoke from his conclusion. Rob responded from concern. Michelle tried to slow the momentum, but momentum had already formed. This is where intention and impact fully diverge. Rob's words, meant to ground, landed as confirmation of everything Nick believed. Michelle's words, meant to mediate, felt like obstruction. And Nick's words, meant to assert agency, sounded like defiance. No one was speaking the same language anymore. Each sentence widened the gap. At some point, the conversation stopped making sense to anyone but themselves. Emotion replaced logic entirely. This is the most dangerous phase. Because once logic leaves the room, consequences don't. Nick's internal resolve reached a breaking threshold, not outwardly explosive, but inwardly fixed. This was the moment of no return. Not because of a single word, not because of a single action, but because perception had fully collapsed into certainty. Rob felt it too, the sudden realization that the situation was slipping beyond his ability to guide it back. That realization carries fear. Fear sharpens everything. Michelle sensed the collision coming before it happened. That sense that whatever happened next would define everything after. She tried once more to intervene. Her voice cut through the tension, not loud, but urgent. Urgency arrived too late. Nick's decision, made in isolation, now collided with reality. And once that collision began, no amount of intention could undo it. The next moments unfolded too fast for reconsideration. Not because anyone wanted harm, but because perception had narrowed so completely that alternatives no longer existed. What followed would be described in fragments, in conflicting accounts, in statements that struggled to capture emotion without explaining it. Because when decisions are made in isolation, the outcome never makes sense to outsiders. And the next chapter begins at the point where everything people assumed was stable finally broke, leaving only aftermath, questions, and a silence no one would ever escape. What do you do when something has happened, but no one yet knows how to name it. That question defines the next stretch of this story. Not the moment itself, not the act, but the strange, suspended space that followed, when reality hadn't fully settled into language and everyone involved was still trying to understand what they were seeing, feeling, and fearing. After the final exchange collapsed into silence again, the house didn't return to stillness. It froze. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that feels staged, artificial, as if everything is waiting for permission to move again. Michelle was the first to sense that something was profoundly wrong, not because of a sound, but because of its absence. The house no longer felt tense, it felt hollow. That shift matters. Tension vibrates. Hollowness absorbs. She called out, not sharply, not panicked, just enough to bridge the distance. There was no answer. That absence landed heavily. The kind of moment where instinct overtakes restraint, where politeness disappears, where fear finally admits its presence. She moved. Rob followed, slower at first, still clinging to the idea that this was another misunderstanding, another emotional spike that would resolve once everyone paused long enough. That belief didn't survive long, because when people walk into a moment they are not prepared for, their bodies recognize it before their minds do. Breathing changes. Movement slows. The world narrows. This is where stories become fragmented. Later accounts struggle here because perception fractures under shock. People remember sensations more than sequences, feelings more than facts. Michelle knew something was wrong before she understood what it was. Rob felt it seconds later. The realization didn't arrive as a single thought. It arrived as a cascade. Something is wrong. This isn't normal. This shouldn't be happening. Those thoughts overlap and blur, making it hard to act decisively at first. People often ask why responses aren't immediate in moments like this. The answer is simple and uncomfortable. The brain resists accepting catastrophe. It searches for alternatives, for benign explanations, for ways to reinterpret what it's seeing. Because accepting the worst possibility changes everything. Michelle's reaction shifted from concern to urgency. Not hysteria. Focus. Urgency has a clarity panic doesn't. She moved faster now, calling out again. Louder. Rob followed more quickly, fear catching up with him. The house felt unfamiliar, like it had been rearranged emotionally in a way physical space couldn't reflect. This is the moment where time distorts most dramatically. Seconds stretch. Movements feel delayed. Everything happens both too fast and too slow. When reality finally broke through denial, it did so incompletely, in fragments, in impressions that didn't yet form a coherent picture. And that incomplete understanding is part of the trauma. Because without clarity, fear fills the gaps. Michelle's mind raced ahead of her senses, searching for explanations, hoping for interruption, for relief. Rob's thoughts went elsewhere, to responsibility, to what he should do, to how to fix something that felt suddenly unfixable. No one felt prepared. No one ever is. At some point, no one later agreed exactly when, the shift from confusion to certainty occurred. Certainty that something irreversible had happened. Certainty that nothing could be reset. That certainty didn't come with comprehension. It came with weight. A weight that settled into the room, into their bodies, into the house itself. The immediate aftermath wasn't dramatic. There were no cinematic reactions, no speeches, no clarity. There was shock. Shock is quiet. It numbs. It fragments. It slows. Michelle's response became procedural, not because she wasn't emotional, but because emotion had nowhere to go yet. She moved on instinct, on habit, on whatever part of her knew how to act when something was deeply wrong. Rob struggled more visibly. His thoughts spiraled between disbelief and guilt, between what he was seeing and what he felt responsible for. This is another truth people resist. In moments like this, responsibility feels universal. Everyone feels it, even when it doesn't belong to them. Especially then. Calls were made. Not all at once. Not cleanly. Hands shook. Words stumbled. Sentences started and restarted. Trying to explain something you don't yet understand is one of the most disorienting experiences a person can have. Michelle spoke first. Her voice was steadier than she felt. She relayed only what she could confirm. Facts without interpretation. That restraint mattered. Rob tried to add context. Explanations. His voice broke. Context didn't help yet. Nothing did. As help was summoned, the house shifted again. this time from private to exposed. The moment when something deeply personal becomes unavoidably public. That transition is brutal. Because once outsiders enter the space, everything changes. The house is no longer a refuge. It's a site. Time moved strangely after that. Waiting stretches. Sounds amplify. Every movement feels intrusive. Michelle felt herself detach slightly. A protective response. The mind stepping back to survive what it can't yet process. Rob remained present but unanchored. He watched events unfold without fully integrating them. This is where trauma embeds itself. Not just in what happened, but in how it was experienced. When authorities arrived, their presence brought structure, but not comfort. Questions followed. Procedures. Protocols. Michelle answered what she could. When she couldn't, she said so. Rob struggled with questions that felt impossible. Not because he was hiding anything, but because he genuinely didn't know how to answer them yet. What happened? When? How did this begin? Those questions assume linear understanding. This situation didn't have that. As the house filled with unfamiliar voices and controlled urgency, the emotional center of the family dissolved completely. There was no we anymore. Only individuals reacting to the same shock in different ways. Nick was no longer part of the immediate interaction. That absence was its own presence. People later debated when exactly the reality of that absence landed. For some, it was immediate. For others, delayed. Shock parcels information slowly. Michelle's thoughts kept returning to earlier moments. To choices. To pauses. To the feeling she'd had that something was wrong before she could explain why. That's the cruel part of hindsight. It convinces people they should have known more than they could. Rob fixated on the last conversation. The last words spoken. The tone he used. The things he didn't say. Those loops are relentless. They replay endlessly, searching for a version where the ending changes. But the ending doesn't change. Only the questions multiply. As the night transitioned into early morning, the house became unrecognizable. Not physically, but emotionally. Every room felt altered. Every object felt implicated. Memories attached themselves to spaces in new, painful ways. This is the stage where people often expect release. Crying, collapse, expression. But release doesn't come immediately. First comes numbness. Michelle moved through the space mechanically. Responding, answering, waiting. Rob sat at times, stood at others, unable to settle. And beneath everything was the growing realization that nothing about their lives would ever return to what it had been hours earlier. Because even before public attention arrived, even before narratives formed, something fundamental had been lost. Not just people, but certainty. Certainty about family, about understanding, about how well you can know those closest to you. As dawn approached, the weight of what had happened began to sink in unevenly. Not all at once, not equally. For Michelle, it arrived as exhaustion so deep it felt physical. For Rob, it arrived as grief tangled with confusion and self-reproach. And for the story itself, this was only the beginning. Because what followed wouldn't just involve private mourning. It would involve questions, scrutiny, interpretations. It would involve the collision between personal tragedy and public narrative, between what was lived and what would be told. And as the first light of morning touched the house, another realization emerged, one that would shape everything next. The night wasn't over yet, because once the sun rose, the story would no longer belong only to those inside the house. And what came next would test every assumption people had. How does a private nightmare become a public narrative overnight? It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in stages, in leaks and fragments, in statements stripped of emotion, in headlines that race ahead of understanding. By the time the sun fully rose, the house was no longer just a home. It was a focal point, a place others would describe, analyze, speculate about, often without ever stepping inside. That transition is brutal. Inside, Michelle and Rob were still moving through shock. Outside, the machinery of attention had already begun to turn. Phones buzzed. Messages stacked up unanswered. The world kept asking questions while those inside the story were still struggling to name what had happened. This is the moment where control truly disappears. Not because someone takes it away, but because the story outgrows its origin. Michelle understood that first. She felt it in the shift of tone from those arriving to help, in the way questions became more formal, more careful, more precise. Precision can feel cold when emotion is raw. Rob felt it differently. As a loss of privacy, so sudden it felt invasive. He had spent decades navigating public attention on his own terms. This was different. This attention didn't care about readiness. It arrived fully formed. As morning progressed, the house filled with movement and procedure. The calm efficiency of professionals contrasted sharply with the internal chaos of those living the moment. Michelle answered questions when she could. When she couldn't, she said so. There's a strength in that honesty, but it doesn't ease the weight. Rob answered too, though his responses drifted at times. His mind kept looping back to the night before, to the last moments that still felt incomplete. This is where memory starts to betray people. Shock doesn't erase memory, it rearranges it. Events replay out of order. Emotions attach themselves to details that may not matter. Important moments blur, while insignificant ones sharpen. That makes certainty elusive. Outside the house, the first whispers began to circulate. Not facts, questions. What happened? When did it happen? Who was there? Questions don't stay neutral for long. They evolve into theories. By late morning, the story had a shape, though not an accurate one. Pieces were missing. Others were distorted. Some were filled in by assumption. That's how narratives work under pressure. People hate uncertainty. They rush to replace.